Together we will defeat the corrupt establishment. We will dethrone the failed political class. We will drain the Washington swamp, and we will save the American dream.
It's time for Donald Trump to pack his bags and go home. We're done.
Good evening, and welcome to Annenberg Radio News special coverage of Election 2020. From Los Angeles, I'm Carolyn Cusero. On one of the most contentious election nights in memory, results are beginning to come in from the East and Midwest. We'll bring you the latest updates from the battleground states that could decide this year's presidential election. We'll talk with our correspondent in Arizona about key Senate races, and we'll check in with our reporter in Washington, D.C. about possible post-election unrest. All of that in a panel discussion on African American, Latinx, and Asian American voters. Florida, as always, is an important state to win for both candidates. Its 29 electoral votes are the third most of any state. Both Biden and Trump and their allies visited Florida many times to get out the vote. In a state which historically has tiny margins for the winner, again, this year, the latest polls are very close. Alexis Gebhardt in Orlando, Florida, joins us now live. Alexis, tell us the latest from Florida.
Florida is seen as a very close call this election. Projections have Biden leading Trump by just 2 or 3 points. Florida has a critical 29 electoral college votes, so Trump losing Florida could actually mean his campaign has a slim chance of winning the overall election. Numbers are just coming in. The polls closed an hour ago across much of the state, and in the Panhandle, the polls just closed a few minutes ago. Right now, with 81% of the polls counted, Trump is leading by 0.2% points over Biden with -0.2 points. This is obviously very, very close. Florida's large Latinx population is a key demographic that could make the difference in this election. More than 2.3 million Hispanic voters are registered in Florida. I spoke with University of Miami political science professor Casey Klofstad about why the Latinx vote is different in Florida than other states. Latinos in Florida tend to be more moderate or even conservative leaning than the aggregate than Latinos in other states. Like by comparison, California, largely because of the Cuban American community, which even to present day tends to be more Republican and more ideologically conservative. Klofstad often also says another key demographic is to the Puerto Rican vote in Florida. He says they tend to vote Democratic, but the question again is how large their voter turnout will be.
So a close battle underway in Florida. Let's turn our attention to a few other swing states. Pennsylvania has been in the news a lot. What's the latest there?
Yes, Pennsylvania is another huge battleground state. It has 20 electoral votes. In fact, the New York Times reports there's a good chance the election results will be determined by Pennsylvania. Polls just closed a few minutes ago, so we are still waiting for the earliest results to come in. The thing that is key in Pennsylvania is the count of the mail-in ballots. After several court challenges by the GOP leading up to Election Day, Pennsylvania voters can now mail in ballots as long as they are postmarked by today, and those will be counted if they are received by November 6th. So far this election, Pennsylvania's had 10 times the number of mail-in ballots as in 2016.
Okay, we covered Florida and Pennsylvania. What about the big Midwest swing states?
Yes, we are talking about Ohio, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Polls just closed a half an hour ago in Ohio. It is rated a toss-up state, but Republicans run stronger here than in other Rust Belt swing states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, a big turnout by youth voters is expected to bring Biden a victory. Also, the urban-rural divide is extreme in Wisconsin, with urban voters favoring Biden and rural voters trending Republican. Polls are still open for another hour in Wisconsin and also in Michigan. Michigan's Black and brown voters were more apathetic in 2016, but they might be the determining vote this year after a summer of protests. And Biden is expected to do well there, with the website 538 saying that he's expected to be the clear winner. But as we all know from 2016, the polls are not always right.
Thanks, Alexis.
Thank you.
We've been talking with Alexis Gebhardt in Orlando, Florida. Now, let's take a look at the Senate races, which will determine if the Democrats can win control of the U.S. Senate. Our reporter Chandler France joins us from Arizona, a state Democrats are watching closely for a possible Senate victory. Democrat Mark Kelly is vying to unseat incumbent Republican Martha McSally. Now, as you may know, Kelly is a former astronaut and husband of Gabby Giffords. Former Congresswoman Giffords survived an assassination attempt in 2011. Hi, Chandler.
Hi, Caroline.
Tell us the latest about what has been unfolding in Arizona.
Sure. So Democrats have the opportunity to hold both of the state Senate seats for the first time since 1953. The other seat is currently held by Democrat Kristen Sinema. The race this year is between incumbent Republican Martha McSally with Democratic challenger and, like you said, former astronaut Mark Kelly. So McSally has been running mostly on a pro-Trump platform, focusing on immigration and painting Kelly and other Democrats as socialists. She's also been putting the blame of COVID-19 on China. Kelly's campaign is focused a lot more on his bipartisanship and how he plans to reach across the aisle if he is elected. Kelly seems to be aligning himself with the late Republican Senator John McCain, very beloved in the state, who was also known for his bipartisanship in serving the state of Arizona. And this may turn out to be a winning strategy, as getting the votes of independent voters is going to be crucial in Arizona. Almost a third of the electorate in Arizona are no party preference voters. So they're not Democrats, they're not Republicans, they can choose either way, and they very well could decide the election this year. Polls have had points, but as Alexis just said, polls can be deceiving. And as far as voting here, polls close in about an hour, and we're hoping to get results within, by the time polls close.
So what other seats are the Democrats vying for?
So the Republicans currently hold a majority in the Senate, but there are many seats in danger of flipping, which could create a Democratic majority in the Senate. In Kentucky, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has faced a fierce challenge from Democrat Amy McGrath. McConnell is the longest serving senator in Kentucky history, having held the seat for 35 years. His challenger, McGrath, was in elementary school when he was first elected. That tells you how long he's been in the Senate for. McConnell has held a comfortable lead in pollings before, and it looks like the Associated Press has called the race for Mitch McConnell with 62% reporting. There's also Maine. Four-term Maine Republican Senator Susan Collins is also in danger of losing her seat to her Democratic challenger, Sarah Gideon. Collins has largely been associated with standing with the president, although she's been trying to move away from that recently, possibly in an attempt to keep her seat. For one example, Collins had stated that the Supreme Court vacancy left by Ruth Bader Ginsburg should not be filled until the election today. But despite that, she still did vote to confirm Amy Coney Barrett just last week. Polls have just closed in Maine, but we do not have any results from that race just yet. Polls in Georgia have also closed, and there are two Senate races that are being watched in the state. We have a special election where three different candidates are actually vying for one seat, two Republican challengers and one Democrat. So the incumbent is Republican Kelly Loeffler. She has a challenge from within her own party, Doug Jones. And as the two candidates split votes between the Republicans in this seat, it seems likely that Democrat Raphael Warnock will win this seat. Polls right now in that election with 11% reporting have Warnock leading by about 6 percentage points. And in the other election in Georgia, we have Republican incumbent David Perdue vying to keep his seat against Democratic challenger Jon Ossoff. And in that one, again, 11% reporting. Perdue is indeed winning right now by about 7 percentage points. We're also looking at many other races across the country. Polls have also closed in North and South Carolina. South Carolina with Lindsey Graham against Jamie Harrison. Graham is currently winning by 2 percentage points with 6% reporting. And in North Carolina, Tom Tillis, the Republican incumbent, is currently winning actually by a lot, by close to 40 percentage points, but only 1% reporting. So a lot more results to come in from both of those races. Polls will also be closing in Colorado in the next hour. Former Governor John Hickenlooper is looking to unseat Republican Cory Gardner. So we will be paying close attention to that. And also close attention to races in Iowa and Montana. Both of those polls in both of those states close at 7 p.m.
Thanks, Chandler. That is Chandler France reporting for us from Arizona. With this contentious election, we have been warned about possible civil unrest and demonstrations in the streets. Here's commentary from ARN's Hannah Woodworth in the nation's capital on Capitol Hill.
This is unlike anything anyone in DC has experienced around an election. You know, around the city, shops and businesses are boarded up. The Capitol Police recently sent an email warning of potential unrest and recommending staffers in the Capitol to work from home this week. Students at George Washington University and Georgetown Universities received emails recommending that they stock up and prepare to isolate in their dorms for the week. I myself went to Trader Joe's last night and for my weekly grocery run, and I saw a lot of people were stocking up. There was even a line that wrapped around the block. Once I made it into the store, I saw signs posted all around that said, "We're all in this together," and the signs even urged people to limit their purchases to one shopping cart and only 2 of each item. But, you know, this is not what an election is supposed to look like. This is beginning to feel almost like a war zone. People are stockpiling, businesses are boarding up their storefronts, and at the end of the day, this is an election. Election days are supposed to be inspiring. It's what makes our democracy work. But elections are the way that we're all able to make our voice count. And it's the day that we're supposed to make the country a better place. But now, due to how emotionally charged this election has become, people are filled with fear, regardless of the outcome. I'm hearing that the unrest is going to ensue after the election is called. But in my opinion, you know, the unrest has already begun. The stockpiling, the boarding up of the storefront, the fear, we're already experiencing unrest. This is my first time voting in a presidential election, and this is the reality. And it's something that myself and other first-time voters around the country and college students have to grapple with, that, you know, this is our reality right now. For Annenberg Media, I'm Hannah Woodworth.
That was commentary from ARN's Hannah Woodworth on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. Racial equity has been at the forefront of this election. America faced a racial reckoning over the death of George Floyd and the protests that followed this summer. That's why our panel tonight will focus on African American, Latinx, and Asian American communities who are mobilizing this year more than ever to make their voices heard. Joining us now are Andrew Pang, editor of The Yappy, a newsletter focused on empowering Asian Pacific and Islander voices. Dr. Steven Nuno Perez is a director of communications and senior analyst at Latino Decision, a leader in Latino political research. And Professor Atiba Ellis, a law professor from Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His research focuses on voting rights. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Hi, thanks.
We'll kick it off with Professor Ellis. As the country has been in the midst of a reckoning over social justice issues and racism, both law and order and police reform have emerged as driving issues for voters on different sides of the political spectrum. How is this issue impacting voter turnout? Are these issues prompting more people to cast ballots?
Well, I think that the issues around law and order probably are driving a lot of the base on either side of the election. And given that, I think that people want to sort of affirm their views around this issue, as well as they feel in particular that, law and order matters if you come from a more conservative point of view. But given the racial reckoning and Black Lives Matter movement, which tends more to speak to the liberal side of American politics, I think that has come to matter as well. So I do think this animates a lot of voters' decisions.
Thank you, Professor Ellis. Now for Dr. Nuno Perez, a question on the Latino vote. I know this year, the Latino community is projected to be the second largest voting demographic behind white people. What are the key issues that the Latinx community wants addressed?
Well, right now and all year, the number one issue has been COVID-19. Latinos have the highest work participation rates in the country. They're largely essential workers. They're less likely to have access to affordable healthcare insurance. And COVID-19 has exposed a lot of inequalities in the country, in particular, in which Latinos are suffering from. So that is the number one issue, and it's not even close. There's not even a second issue on the list of issues that we've had throughout the year.
And lastly, to Andrew for some thoughts on the Asian American vote. We're curious, is there such thing as an Asian American vote, or is the community too large, too diverse, and too intergenerational to be considered a convenient monolith?
So what I have to say to this is, there's so much incredible diversity, and I think that the term, yes, is pretty outdated. The term Asian American was pretty much created through activism, but there's so many different segments: Southeast, South, and Eastern Asian. And there's also a lot of question of whether Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders should be also included within the AAPI label that's commonly seen in government. So I think yes.
Awesome. Thank you all for those eloquent responses. For my next question, anyone, please feel free to jump in and share your thoughts. So people of color are largely Democratic voters. Trump doesn't have to win them entirely, and winning a relatively small percentage of those votes can make for a big difference in his campaign. So if we shave off some of those votes, what does that mean for the outcome of this election?
I can jump in. So Asian Americans account for about 5% of the national eligible voter population, totaling 11 million. We've already seen record turnout in a lot of the Sun Belt and Southern states. Every single battleground state that's been polled has already exceeded 2016 voter turnout with just the early votes. So, Trump has been seizing a lot of the Vietnamese and Indian vote. He's gained in those sort of areas since 2016, but he's also lost a lot of support among Chinese American voters, and he's deep underwater among others. So if he can achieve a bit of the Indian and Vietnamese voters, he can turn a lot of the tide towards him.
I'll also jump in and speak to the fact that African American voters tend to be the most unified behind the Democrats. However, there is a consistent somewhere 10 to 12% of African American voters who have tended to vote Republican and may well vote for Trump. That in and of itself may not impact the result, but given my work regarding voter suppression and the sort of reports from around the country regarding vote counts being affected by litigation and the possibility of court interference, that kind of shaving off the vote may well have an impact as well.
And I'll say Latinos contribute to different states in different ways. In some states like California and Arizona, where they're the dominant minority group, they have a different role in politics in those states. In states like Texas and Florida, where they're a little bit more diverse, they're in play, and both sides will court the Latino vote and probably have a greater impact if you can squeeze more Latino voters, say Cuban voters in South Florida, now Venezuelan and Colombian voters in South Florida. Puerto Ricans, about 300,000 new Puerto Ricans have come into Florida because of hurricanes Irma and Maria. But also Latinos play important roles as coalition partners in places like Georgia, North Carolina, Michigan, and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. So their contribution and how they perform and how they're looked at depends sort of where they're at. and where they're at compared to the other groups where they can sway an election, they can help dominate an election like in California, or they're actual, being courted by the various parties.
Right. Thank you all for that. And one last question before we wrap up here, a little bit changing gears. So we see the Squad as a group of young women of color in Congress. Are we going to see more African-American, Latinx, and other people of color rising to elected office today? Are there more rising stars who may be winning office?
Geez, I hope so. You have, a bunch of 75-year-olds running the country, like McConnell, and even on the Democratic side, it'd be great. We're seeing record turnout in places like Texas, and hopefully with this, we can see changes in leadership in Congress. It's going to start at the local level. We're already seeing it more in the boards, school boards, mayors, city councils. That will eventually change on up the ladder.
I would also say that given the Barack Obama effect, if you will, that a number of African Americans have been inspired to run and have made high profile runs. And I think, given the example of people like Stacey Abrams, that we have an increase of African Americans running for office. And I think that trend is just going to increase further in this election and going forward.
I think for Asian American voters, you're already going to see history tonight. We already have a record number of state legislative candidates running. There's about more than a dozen state and House and Senate candidates that are running, especially in states like California and Texas. And I've spoken to a lot of Democratic organizers who say that APIs will make the margin of victory in a lot of these key swing states.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all we have time for. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for being here this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We've been talking with Marquette University law professor Ativa Ellis, also Stephen Nuno Perez with Latino Decision, a leader in Latino political research, and Andrew Pang, editor of The Yappy. Before we end our show, we have results coming in. Olivia Korish will be giving you the latest from the Associated Press. Olivia?
Hey there. So beginning off with Florida, we have a critical swing state. Our numbers are just coming in. The polls closed a few minutes ago. Right now, with 86% of the vote counted, Trump is leading with 50.5% over Biden with 48.7%. In Kentucky, we have Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who's expected to win re-election. Right now, McConnell has 56.1% to Democratic challenger Amy McGrath, who has 40.3%, and that's with 66% of the vote counted. In that presidential race, we have Trump leading Biden by 59.9% to 38.57% with 67% of the vote counted. And then we have in Georgia, we have Trump leading Biden by 56% to 43% with 18% of the votes counted. And then in the much anticipated Senate race, we have David Perdue leading Jon Ossoff by about 15 percentage points. And in Georgia's special Senate election, after the resignation of Republican Johnny Isakson, Democratic Raphael Warnock is leading Kelly Loeffler by less than 1 percentage points. Finally, we also have in South Carolina, Trump is leading Biden by 49.4% to 49.4%, so a very slim margin there. And that's only with 8% of votes reported. And in their Senate race, incumbent Lindsey Graham and former lobbyist Jamie Harrison is leading by less than 1 percentage points. And in Ohio, key swing state, we have 45% of the votes reported with Biden leading Trump by 55.2% to 43.6%. And in North Carolina, with 2% of the votes reported, Trump is leading Biden by 63% to 36%. In Pennsylvania, which just closed at 5 p.m. Pacific time as well, Keystone State, we have 4% of the votes counted. Biden is leading with 81 percentage points to 18.2 percentage points. And lastly, in Maine, we have 1% of the votes counted. Trump is leading Biden by 87.5% to 12.5%. And that's all I have for you guys.
Thank you, Olivia. We'll update you again in the next hour with more poll returns on this historic day in America. Voter turnout across the nation appears to be very high, with possibly more than 2/3 of the eligible voting population taking part. We seem to be headed towards the highest voter turnout in more than 100 years. So make sure to join us in the second half of ARN's election coverage starting at 6 p.m. And that's all for this first round of our Election Day coverage. Celine Mendoza is the managing producer. Josh Chang is the managing editor. A special thanks to Shirley Jihad, Tina Rubio, Sebastian Gruber, and Edward Lifson. And starting at 6 p.m., stay tuned for a discussion among young Trojans to mobilize the youth vote, featuring a surprise panelist for all you loyal ARN alums and two of your very own Annenberg media staffers.